Welcome back to The Beat, where we've been following some developing stories late today. The president holding an unusual press conference to announce a surrender after a rebuke by the Supreme Court over the citizenship question, and he was joined by his Attorney General, Bill Barr. Now, in a moment, Senator Cory Booker is here with me live on the story. But take a listen to Mr. Barr claiming the administration never actually considered adding the citizenship question, to the census by executive fiat.
One other point on this. Some in the media have been suggesting, in the hysterical mode of the day, that the administration has been planning to add the citizenship question to the census by executive fiat without regard to contrary court orders or what the Supreme Court might say. This has been based on rank speculation and nothing more. As should be obvious, this has never been under consideration. We have always accepted that any new decision to add a citizenship question to the census would be subject to judicial review.
I'm joined now by a U.S. Senator on the Judiciary Committee and 2020 presidential candidate, Senator Cory Booker. Thanks for joining me in that press conference. The President and the Attorney General, who you oversee on your committee, said that today marks a victory for the Trump administration's position. Is that true?
No, this was another rank failure of his, echoing back to when he set up a commission to study all the so-called illegal voters and millions of people that illegally voted in his campaign. This is a pattern of his where he's attempted to do things, get stopped by the courts, public outcries, even people within his own party. This was a cynical attempt in the start, and now he's still standing in the Rose Garden talking about terrorizing immigrant communities, separating families, tearing away business owners and parents and grandparents. This immigration policy is all about fear, and his attempts to inject fear into our culture, to suppress the count and a constitutionally mandated count in the census, and give himself some kind of political advantage by playing from the same playbook that we've seen throughout our history by demagogues. In fact, we had an entire political party that rose up using the same language as this president, but then they were against Irish and Italian immigrants. Then it was the Know Nothing Party. We are a nation of immigrants. It makes us stronger, and there are bipartisan ways we can be dealing with this, not the kind of cynical failure that we just saw where this president has now finally capitulated, not only to public outcry, but even the Supreme Court, that if you read that decision by the Chief Justice, seems like he was calling him out for not telling the truth, which is a shocker.
Right, and when the court, as you and I know, I think our viewers have come to know, the Supreme Court avoids saying that if it can. It does not just blast government officials as liars if they can find what they call a more benign reading. And yet, as you say, I think that the ruling showed, they just said, they said it was contrived. They said it wasn't a true rationale. And that brings us, I guess, to the credibility of Mr. Barr, who you've tangled with. Here he was today on the census question. He also, according to the New York Times, has been trying to intercede and prevent Bob Mueller's staff from talking even in private sessions to congressional committees, which is relevant to you, as Mueller prepares to testify next week. What is your view of Mr. Barr, of the contempt vote against him, and of what people should actually expect from a hearing that many experts in our own review suggest could be quite dry because of the nature of Bob Mueller's approach to the job?
If someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. This is a guy that has been taking one of the most important law enforcement positions in the entire planet, and has shown himself not to be an independent office, but more like Donald Trump's personal lawyer. And seems to be engaging in practices now on a consistent basis that are more about trying to protect a president who seriously needs some legal help and legal backing because of the things he's done, the misconduct he's engaged in. And so I am so frustrated. I voted obviously against Barr, but he has gone so far beyond what I could have imagined someone would do, and bending over backwards to be a personal lawyer to a president, as opposed to honoring the sacred and critical role he plays as should be playing as an independent legal actor in our nation.
And do you look at the Mueller hearing as a wrap up of the Mueller report, and then people move on, or as a beginning of a question of whether impeachment hearings should proceed?
Look, you know that I'm on the Judiciary Committee, and we just got last week, and I went down and read some of the unredacted reports, but then I went back and reread it in sections in total. I really hope that Americans go and read this report. It is, as it stands, even with the redactions, it is a deep implication. Mueller clearly says there are about 10 things that point to misconduct. Here's someone who has instructed people to lie, instructed people to change documents, had people on his campaign team cooperating with foreign adversaries. I mean, there is just so much there. And now he is, instead of acting like the leader of the free world, he's acting like an authoritarian leader by denying Congress what their constitutional duty is, which is to provide checks and balances to the administration, to provide administrative oversight. So this is one of those times I've said very clearly, I was not a quick person towards beginning impeachment proceedings, but seeing what I'm seeing right now, that Congress is being stymied by this president, and when there's real clear evidence, or anybody reads the plain black and white of the Mueller report, that there is clear evidence of misconduct there, this is unacceptable what's going on right now. The Congress should be able to continue its work, and it's a shame that we're now seeing this not only having to go into the courts, but potentially being stymied by a president that seems to be without remorse in his willingness to subvert the Constitution.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.